magnificent, mysterious, and misunderstood. Florida's great swamp, the Everglades, has been maligned and mistreated for more than a century. Although part of the vast wet wilderness became Everglades National Park in 1947, that same year, work began on a complex system of drainage canals that would change South Florida and the swamp forever. On the western edge of the Everglades, threats to the cypress-studded marshland that stretched to the 10,000 islands inspired a groundswell of grassroots conservation efforts and propelled Collier County to the forefront of an environmental battle that would go all the way to the Supreme Court. Despite decades of attempts to drain and claim the Everglades, by 1947, South Florida's great swamp remained unconquered and uncontrolled.
Nature was frowning. The trouble was water. Too much of it on one hand, not enough of it on the other. Something had to be done, and something was. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was assigned the mission of planning and designing a complete project for flood control throughout the district. Altogether, the entire project tackled represents one of the largest earth-moving jobs since the digging of the Panama Canal.
The Central and Southern Florida Flood Control Project culminated nearly a century of dreams to drain the Everglades, the vast wetland that once covered almost all of South Florida. In the 1800s, soldiers during the Seminole Wars deemed the wet wilderness a tiresome wasteland. But the first government report on the region noted that the Everglades held promise if the swamp could be drained. By 1881, reclamation projects were underway, financed by Hamilton Diston, who agreed to drain up to 12 million acres of the Everglades in exchange for half of the swampland his dredges successfully reclaimed. Diston's dream to improve one-third of Florida's landmass didn't come true, but he did manage to dig more than 80 miles of drainage canals, including a narrow canal that connected the Caloosahatchee River to Lake Okeechobee. Although that man-made link would one day cause problems further south, Diston's digging didn't drain the western edge of the Everglades, an intricate mosaic of marshlands, cypress trees, pine flatwoods, and prairies called the Big Cypress Swamp. Few ventured into this menacing, mysterious marshland except to hunt. Pioneers roamed the wet wilderness in search of alligators and plume birds. The fancy feathers decorated fashionable ladies' hats, but the massacre of millions of birds for millinery eventually inspired one of America's first conservation crusades. Plume hunters targeted bird rookeries throughout the Big Cypress, including a large nesting site in Corkscrew Swamp.
The issue that started the Audubon societies back at the turn of the earlier century, 1900s, was the killing of the plume birds for their feathers. And this is one of the places that was such an important nesting site that the Audubon Society sent wardens here to guard the birds in Corkscrew Swamp Forest. And that was 1910, 1911, 1912. Fortunately, that was a successful campaign and the plume hunting stopped.
Conservationists stopped the plundering of the plume birds, but they couldn't stop the draining of the Everglades. The campaign to drain the vast wasteland and tap the wealth of the fabulous muck continued. On the western edge of the Everglades, the Big Cypress Swamp remained primeval and pristine. But that was about to change. Baron Gift Collier, an advertising tycoon and would-be developer, owned more than 1 million acres of land in southwest Florida, and in 1923 he became the namesake of the new Collier County. Collier's ambitious plans included completing the first cross-state road through the Everglades, the Tamiami Trail. The new road opened with great fanfare in 1928 and opened the once remote region to development. While promoters saw rich possibilities, others saw a wilderness wonderland, including Ernest Coe, who began a crusade to save the swamp as a national park. Battling the drain and claim developers, however, proved difficult. Although Congress approved the park in 1934, it took 13 years to get funding and to agree on the borders of the park. Despite Coe's best efforts, all of the Big Cypress Swamp and everything north of the Tamiami Trail was excluded from the park. Outside the hard-won boundaries of the park, development of the Everglades continued. Within the Big Cypress, in a swampy section called the Fakahatchee Strand, the Lee Tidewater Cypress Company began harvesting the soaring cypress trees.
The logging of the Fakahatchee Strand in particular started right around 1943. It was a U.S. Navy contract. They needed the large old-growth cypress trees for hulls of minesweepers, but also for PT boats and decks of aircraft carriers. World War II is really what caused the beginning of the end of the world's largest strand swamp, at least in its old-growth form.
Over the next 10 years, the company built hundreds of miles of track beds for the train that hauled the fell giants to Perry, Florida for milling. By the early 1950s, the loggers were closing in on Corkscrew Swamp and one of the last large stands of old-growth cypress in Collier County.
The ornithologists of the day were coming here to check on the birds and noticed that the forest was being clear-cut out from under the nesting colonies. So then there was a national campaign to save the forest. And that started in 1952 and 3, and by 1954, enough money had been raised to purchase the land from the loggers and the Collier family. And Corkscrew Swamp was established, December of 1954. Today, Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary is the largest stand of unlogged bald cypress in North America.
Although there was no access road to the new Audubon Society sanctuary, hardy hikers braved muck and mire to see the 700-year-old giants of the swamp.
I know we had visitation here immediately. We had people coming in off-road vehicles. There was a dirt road coming out of Immokalee that people used to come out. It was a logging road.
Construction of a boardwalk through the heart of the swamp began in 1955, and 5 years later, visitors were flocking to see this rare remnant of Florida's primeval past.
My first attendance date is from 1960, and that was 10,000 people in 1960, and there was no paved road here. So that was a lot of people trying real hard to see this old-growth cypress.
The breathtaking beauty of the ancient trees inspired Lester Norris, a Naples philanthropist, to buy the remaining unlogged section of the Fakahatchee Strand in 1957, 2 weeks before the last giants standing were slated to be cut down.
My father was rather horrified because he knew it, and he said, oh, to cut down all those gorgeous cypress trees. And so he quickly got a hold of his lawyer and made an arrangement and bought the land to save it from logging. I think that surprised him to think anybody would even dream of cutting those trees down.
Saving the towering trees established a new paradigm for the fledgling conservation movement in Collier County. The best way to protect the land was to buy it. By the early 1960s, Collier County was no longer remote and rustic. With the help of air conditioning and mosquito control, Florida's final frontier was booming. On Marco Island, Robert Elliott and Frank Mackel Jr., the respected founders of the Deltona Corporation, unveiled plans for their newest project.
Recently, a new era has begun. Great earth movers are changing the face of Marco, changing the pace, moving to a new concept of the future. The making of this beautiful subtropic island into the most amazing project ever imagined. See it as it will be, as we take to the air and fly over this sensational three-dimensional model, constructed with absolute detail to show the Marco of the future.
As dredges began to carve canals on Marco Island, a proposed county road through the maze of mangroves to the north galvanized grassroots action to stop what conservationists dubbed the road to nowhere. The proposed road, slated to run through the heart of Rookery Bay, drew strong opposition from conservationists, including Lester Norris, who rallied to protect the watery wilderness. Conservationists stunned county commissioners with a petition signed by more than 1,000 people against the road.
Said, these are the people who do not want that road. Now show me the people who want it. And there was dead silence. From that time on, it was a dead issue. But it was the beginning of the Conservancy.
Defenders of the Bay formed the Collier County Conservancy and followed the proven method of protection, launching an ambitious campaign to purchase and permanently protect the maze of mangroves. An anonymous group of tax-conscious citizens immediately launched a campaign to stop the Conservancy, noting in a series of newspaper ads,
"This land will remain an impenetrable mangrove swamp, inaccessible and useless. The eventual development of this land is vital to the growth and future of Naples and its economy."
The Conservancy successfully defeated the developer-driven campaign, and within a year had purchased more than 2,000 acres surrounding the bay. In 1967, the land was deeded to the National Audubon Society to manage as the Rookery Bay Sanctuary.
They did a good job of connecting the community's interest to what Rookery Bay was all about. It's not just about mangroves, it's about fishing, and it's about the aesthetic value of the area, and it's about the local economy and sort of a quality of life issue. There's no doubt about it, at that time we were looking at coastal landscapes across South Florida that were changing forever. I think this was a very visionary effort to try to make sure that this landscape was preserved and remained intact.
While Naples gained national acclaim for saving Rookery Bay, Gulf American Land Corporation broke ground in eastern Collier County on the world's largest subdivision, Golden Gate. The mega development included Golden Gate Estates, platted to include 170 miles of drainage canals and more than 800 miles of roads, all in the soggy heart of the Big Cypress Swamp.
At that time, there was no planning department in the 5 southwest Florida counties. Collier County didn't even have a planning department.
The landscape seemed unlimited, and that's the reason that places like Golden Gate were designed and approved the way they were. As big as it still wasn't putting a dent in anything.
Gulf American founders Leonard and Julius Rosen, developers of Cape Coral in Lee County, launched an aggressive and highly successful sales campaign that amazed one magazine writer.
In its most fantastic operation so far, Gulf American is selling thousands of acres of water to people who come down to Florida to buy dirt.
The joke was you're buying land by the gallon. The roads and the canals were put in over a period of years starting in the 1960s, and they continued construction on that all the way up into the 70s. And this was done at a time when there was not any protection at all on wetlands. It was just regarded as something to get the water off.
The Golden Gate canals nearly drained the Big Cypress dry and created an environmental disaster for Collier County.
They put in a series of 4 parallel canals to drain the water out of the Picayune Strand. And they did a good job. That water goes right down to Tye. They all join into one called the Faka-Union Canal. When they did that, there were no weirs or stop logs in them or dams or anything. The water flowed 24 hours a day. Rainy season, dry season, it didn't matter. We did that for many years, and so it lowered the water table after a few years by 6 to 8 feet.
Over-drainage sparked wildfires that devastated the Big Cypress, and within a few years, nearly a quarter of Collier County had been scorched by fire. Further south, the Faka-Union Canal flooded the fragile estuaries of the 10,000 islands with too much fresh water, devastating the delicate nursery grounds for sport and commercial fish species. Gulf American was under increasing scrutiny for its shady swampland deals and shoddy environmental record, and the state of Florida belatedly clamped down on the company. As part of a settlement, Gulf American gave its unsold swampland in the Fakahatchee Strand back to the state. Although it was a brief reprieve for the Big Cypress, the rest of the Everglades was in big trouble. By the late 1960s, the canals of the Central and Southern Florida Flood Control Project were draining the lifeblood from the swamp. Everglades National Park was drying up, and alligators were on the brink of extinction. Another threat also loomed: the building of the world's largest supersonic jetport just 6 miles from the park. The supersized supersonic airport was slated to be bigger than the city of Miami and would span 39 square miles, mostly in Collier County and squarely in the Big Cypress Swamp.
They were going to have elevated monorails running from Dade County out there to the airport, and all these plans for all this growth and development in the Big Cypress north of the park. We never thought we'd stop it, but people really galvanized on it, and we knew if it was built that we were going to lose the Big Cypress integrity of it, and its watershed was critical to the downstream of the Everglades National Park, 10,000 islands.
2 runways were built soon after groundbreaking. Jetport supporters casually dismissed conservation concerns, calling the Big Cypress typical South Florida real estate.
The county commission thought it was a wonderful idea. You got this wasteland, this swamp out there, let's do something with it.
But the drain and claim days were numbered, and the jetport became a catalyst for change, a turning point in recognizing that perhaps the great swamp had greater value to man as a swamp.
The federal people started interacting for the first time really with us local people, grassroots people in Florida, and finally we were able to stop it.
It was a resounding rejection of the status quo and a landmark victory for conservationists. But the Big Cypress remained vulnerable to development. A post-jetport study of the swamp warned that the Big Cypress has the potential for becoming the textbook example of ecological ruin.
There were realtors selling thousands of acres out there to people all over the world. The thought was, we've got to put this into some kind of protected status.
Although Congress was interested in protecting the Big Cypress, the state would have to come up with the first chunk of money. Conservationists rallied again.
The state of Florida came up with $40 million, the first money, the seed money to buy the Big Cypress.
In 1974, Congress authorized the creation of the Big Cypress National Preserve. The new preserve included more than 500,000 acres and was one of the largest federal land acquisition projects in history. Hunting and oil drilling would still be permitted, but development was forever banned in the preserve, protecting a vital source of water for Everglades National Park and for the people of Southwest Florida. That same year, Gulf Americans' forfeited lands in the Fakahatchee Strand were incorporated into a new state preserve. The sole remaining section of unlogged forest saved by Lester Norris in 1957 was later added to the preserve. While the new preserves helped protect the fragile flow of water to the fringe of mangroves further south, the tangle of trees on the edge of the Everglades were soon facing a new threat. The Deltona Corporation applied for new dredging permits for Marco Island and announced plans to dredge and fill an area of mangroves on the mainland, right next to the Rookery Bay Sanctuary.
They thought they could go ahead and get the rest of this thing permitted, so they continued to sell land. And the land they were selling was not land, a lot of it was underwater.
Conservation groups rallied to rescue the threatened wetlands, adding a new weapon to their arsenal: hard science. Scientific studies conducted in Rookery Bay helped prove the importance of the once maligned mangrove trees.
Nobody had much of an idea of the importance, the contribution, the nursery function, the food production areas that were there. This was new stuff. It was going to change the way we thought and behaved with those resources. And if we didn't change our behavior, there were clear consequences.
Already, the consequences of dredge and fill development were becoming clear on Marco Island.
It ended up being the largest wetland impact that ever occurred in North America.
Deltona's new dredging permits were denied, and the company began a long series of appeals and lawsuits.
Several things started happening, and one of them was the science being done by people like Bernie was driving the regulatory environment at the federal and state level, and the rules began to change.
The Mackle brothers' dream ended in 1982, when the Supreme Court denied their last appeal and ended dredge and fill development in Florida.
You have property rights and you have certain vested interests, but they cannot totally ignore the public interest and the natural system interest. So that was really a precedent-setting court case.
The public began to understand that there were rational reasons, not just emotions, for protecting wetlands.
Most of Deltona's wetlands surrounding Rookery Bay were incorporated into the newly established Rookery Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, formed from acreage saved long ago by the Conservancy. The Green Revolution was gaining traction in Florida, and in 1972, Florida voters overwhelmingly approved the state's first bond issue for acquiring environmentally sensitive lands. By the mid-1980s, Gulf American's boom-time boondoggle, South Golden Gate Estates, was on the acquisition list. Most of this section of the world's largest subdivision remained a ghost town grid of dead-end roads and drainage canals.
When Bob Grand was governor, he included the southern Golden Gate Estates area in the Save Our Everglades program with the intent of ultimately purchasing this land from these individual owners and then to try to restore it at some level. And that was a monumental task. Within that 37,000 acres were 17,000 individual lots and 22,000 individual owners. The owners were scattered all over the country.
The state estimated it would take at least 10 years to complete the buyback, igniting fears that the critical restoration project might never become a reality. To help speed up the process, the Conservancy offered to help with the piles of paperwork required to buy back Gulf American's most infamous swampland swindle.
If nobody had stepped up and tried to help expedite that thing, they could still be struggling with this.
With the help of the Conservancy and other groups, the state eventually purchased nearly 55,000 acres in South Golden Gate Estates, and part of the world's largest subdivision became the Picayune Strand State Forest.
It's now part of the restoration of the Western Everglades. The objective of this is to fill in the majority of these canals, bring the water table back up, and actually put water back on the land. So it's a real, honest-to-gosh, hydrological restoration project.
Buying land was still the best way to protect it, but the damage done by drainage canals beyond the borders of South Golden Gate Estates proved that buying isolated parcels wasn't enough.
There was a broadening awareness that you can't just buy up some core lands around an estuary like Rookery Bay and expect it to be in protection forever.
Although nearly 65% of Collier County is now publicly owned and protected, development pressures continue to threaten wetlands outside the borders of conservation lands.
Nobody ever believed that wood storks would have been a rare bird, but now they're a federally endangered species. Wood storks are completely wetland dependent. Our water supplies come from wetlands that recharge the groundwater. That's where our water comes from. And then you got to have water flowing out of these natural wetlands to support the estuaries and the whole coastal system.
Despite the hard lessons of the past, drainage and development remain the biggest threats to the western edge of the Everglades.
I think that there sometimes is a misunderstanding that it's more costly to protect the environment, when in all reality, the alternatives to not protecting these critical recharge areas, these critical wetland areas, is going to be far more expensive. And we know that because Everglades restoration projects have borne that out to be true.
Already, millions of dollars have been spent undoing the damage caused by Gulf American's drainage canals, once part of the world's largest subdivision, and now part of the world's largest environmental project, the restoration of the Everglades.
Today we're talking about restoring the Everglades, so hopefully we will repair them, but we'll never put them back like they once were. We need everybody involved.
Environmental protection initiatives come from people. They don't come from the government. It comes from the people. The legacies of environmental tragedies and triumphs
span Collier County, but the story of protecting paradise is far from finished.
We're seeing a very big push right now to develop an area twice the size of Miami in eastern Collier County. The stakes have really never been higher for protecting our quality of life. I think we've made some great strides and we've had many successes, but the biggest challenges in most cases are yet to come.
To purchase a copy of this and other WGCU produced programs, go to WGCU.org or call 1-888-824-0030. This program was produced for the citizens of Southwest Florida by WGCU Public Media. Show your appreciation for programs like these. Become a member of WGCU, a business supporter, or leave a legacy through estate or planned gift. Call or visit our website at WGCU.org.